History 322, Modern Asia. This is week 6 and audio number 2. I talked about this a bit last week when World War II came to an end with the dropping of the 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki on 6 and 9 August, respectively, 1945. The war came to an end about a week later when Emperor Hirohito made his surrender announcement and ordered all Japanese forces to surrender to the Allies. However, even people who were involved in the Manhattan Project, that is, the Manhattan as in New York, the Manhattan Project, even people who were involved in that knew about the bomb, knew about the plans to drop it, did not anticipate that Japan would surrender so quickly. As a matter of fact, U.S. troops who were in Europe at the time were fairly certain that they would be shipped to the Far East, that is, to Asia, not the Far East, that they'd be shipped to Asia to fight the Japanese and invade the Japanese home islands. And everybody expected to be killed because they were convinced, and I think not without reason, that the Japanese would fight to the death to defend the home islands, that taking the home islands would be an extremely difficult task, very bloody. And so that's why a lot of Americans were thrilled when the atomic bombs were dropped and the Japanese almost immediately surrendered because they knew that a lot of lives had been saved. Some estimates were that 1 million lives were saved by this. This is no excuse for the nature of the atom bomb. Just for a moment, I want to say that lots of people have second-guessed all this. I don't know if I'm one of them, really. I have many conflicting thoughts about this whole thing. However, one should note that there was a strong desire for revenge on the part of the Americans for what happened at Pearl Harbor, not to mention other things like the Bataan Death March in the Philippines, which I'm not covering here, I think, but you can find this on the web. Bataan is B-A-T-A-A-N. That's a place in the Philippines. And when this has to do with how the Japanese disposed of Filipino and American prisoners of war after they surrendered in the Philippines in February of 1942. And it was pretty much what it says it was. It was a death march. When the atomic bombs were dropped, of course, they were dropped on civilian areas that were relatively untouched, partly in order to measure the effectiveness of the atom bomb for potential future use. So all of those things together make not a very pretty picture, but it happened, and it is what it was. So getting back to the main point here, people expected the war in the Pacific to go on and on. And so when the Japanese did surrender, the situation that existed was that there were Japanese forces all over Asia. There were a couple million men out there who were still armed and still dangerous, and the emperor had told them to surrender, so no one really knew how effective that order would be, perhaps except for Japanese planners themselves. And if you take a look at the movie that is posted in D2L for this week, the Harp of Burma, or the Burmese Harp, that movie shows an instance where, very realistic, I think, where the central character tries to convince a Japanese unit that is isolated to surrender in accordance with the emperor's orders, and they throw him out on his ear, and they all die fighting. Except for him, he escapes, and so that's part of the central, I wouldn't want to spoil it, central storyline. And so nobody, for example, the British and Malaya, wanted the Japanese to surrender to somebody else because they didn't want somebody else, such as an underground guerrilla movement, to have Japanese weapons. In China, I think we've gone over this last week, the Japanese, rather the nationalists and the communists, scrambled to take surrender of as many Japanese units as possible to get their weapons. And this was going on basically all over Asia, except there weren't active civil wars in other places, but there was potential for insurgency. And then it took more than a year to ship everybody back to Japan, and indeed there's one other video that addresses this basic situation that I urge you to take a look at. It's not very long. It's the segment from the Kurosawa movie Dreams. Going on to slide 10, now we can talk a bit about the new nation states in Southeast Asia. I don't intend for this to be exhaustive, and I've covered some of it in next week's lecture, so I'm trying to hit the points here that are not covered next week. Go to slide 11, and just to remind you, from last time, we had this big civil war going on in China that began soon after the Japanese surrender, within a year after the Japanese surrender, pretty much. And really in some places it was really underway not long after the Japanese surrender. And it ended with the communist victory in October of 1949. And so this, of course, was of tremendous influence throughout not only Asia but the world, that the Chinese had undergone a communist revolution, that they had leaned to one side, that is to Moscow, and that they were anti-American. Going on to slide 12. So in that context, there were different post-colonial visions. There were, as I pointed out a few minutes ago, the elites differed. There were the people who had been educated in the colonial tradition, in the colonist language, and wanted to continue to use that language for official business. There were people who were rural leaders. You can read about one of them, for example, named Sayasan, I think his name was, Sayasan in Burma, a rural leader who sounds an awful lot like Mao Zedong when you read his account. This is in Burma, who wanted to abolish those institutions as well as get rid of the colonists, who wanted to set up something entirely domestic and native. And the European colonizers themselves, these colonies had been part of their economy, of course. They gradually realized that they could not hold on to these colonies politically, but they wanted to preserve economic ties, and they wanted to make sure that their own businesses, who after all were bankrolling their political campaigns, it was true back then, just like it is now, except we didn't have Karl Rove. Anyway, they wanted to make sure that their own businesses, which of course were employing their own people, were able to continue to do business in the colonies, the former colonies. So they wanted a business-friendly environment. That's sort of a modern term, but it applied back then as well. This man, by the way, in the photograph at the top right, that's Aidit, who was the leader of the PKI, the Parti Komunis Indonesia, Indonesian Communist Party, and he does have a Mao Zedong haircut there. I just imagine that was not an accident. It's not something that happened when he went into the hairstylist by chance, but I'm only speculating. He actually kind of resembles a young Mao Zedong too, doesn't he? Going on to lucky slide 13. So Burma, I'm covering this in a little bit more detail partly because it's not in the readings. In the first 30 years of the 20th century, the British gradually came to the realization that they needed to rule Burma through its elites. And so they did what they could through educating those elites, same as in Malaysia, in the English language and in British schools where possible, whether those schools were in Burma, sponsored schools, or whether they were actually making it into British universities in dribs and drabs. They made sure that they educated what they hoped would be a pro-British elite. However, in Burma, this didn't work out so well like it did in Malaysia. There was anti-colonial feeling that was much stronger in Burma. I'm afraid that I can't really pinpoint the cause of that, but that's the way it was. There was a constitution that is probably partly because Burma did not have as strong an economy. Things were not as good there as they were in Malaya. Although during this period, Burma gained the nickname of Rice Basket of Asia because the rice exports from Burma were so strong. Anyway, there was gradual letting go, very slow, by the British, bit by bit, of control of the reins of government, and they were planning to move toward handing over control for everything except defense and the police, hoping to keep control of those things for an indefinite period. But then along came the Japanese. Along came 1942. As in Vietnam, and we'll learn more about this next week, as in Vietnam, the leaders of the Buddhist clergy leaders, the senior Buddhist abbots in the country, were opposed to the entire system of the British government. They thought that it was completely foreign, alien, needed to be gotten rid of, along with the British. But they were not pro-communist, also as in Vietnam. They were a third force of sorts, and they were a very strong third force. Then there were the anti-colonial leaders who were inclined toward learning about the military arts, Aung San and Ne Win. Ne Win had a different name in those early years, but I don't want to complicate it. Ne Win is or Ne Win is the name that he adopted in the post-war period, and he eventually became Burma's leader. Aung San was the most popular leader and was able to talk to both the left and the right, that is, to conservative anti-communists and to pro-communists. And his assassination in 1947 ended the possibility, unfortunately, of any sort of coalition. Not that it would necessarily have worked anyway, but there we are. So when he died, there was it was right before independence in January of 1948, and there was immediately a civil war between the government and the communists, which lasted for 2 decades, more than 2 decades. And there were insurgencies that began in the north with the Karen and other minorities that continued for 4 decades. So it was an incredibly difficult situation in Burma. The civilian government that followed independence was in charge of the military, but there was the desire on the part of many to have a Praetorian regime. Praetorian regime means a military government. And as the civilian government grew weaker, eventually there were 2 coups, and the second coup, the first one was only temporary in nature, but the second coup in 1962 resulted in Ne Win being made the leader of the country, and he pursued this awful program, which is called the the Burmese way to socialism, which led to the impoverishment of the entire country. And I don't know how they managed it, because I'm not a Burma specialist, but it resulted in a dramatic drop in the rice crop and a cessation of Burma's place as a major exporter of that grain. Take a look at Ne Win in this photograph. He's sitting on a couch, and a junior officer, the man in white there, has brought him something to sign. And unless the junior officer has his legs cut off at the knees, he appears to be kneeling. And this this symbolizes the way Ne Win ruled Burma. He was an absolute strongman. He purged enemies. He ruled with an iron fist. And he took a very anti-Western stance as the years went on. If you were to have gone to Burma 4 or 5 years ago, you would have seen, even at that late date, big billboards all over Rangoon, or Yangon, as it's called, the former capital of Burma. You would see great big billboards with anti-American slogans on them. Going on, and it wasn't a communist country either. It was a Japanese ally through most of World War II until 1944. Going on to slide 14. So we've been through some of these awful cases of Japanese behavior in Asia. There were a couple of exceptions. Taiwan, big exception, which had been taken over decades before from China, was a Japanese colony that was not conquered, and the people there were taught Japanese in schools. Taiwan was not subject to Japanese cruelty that was so common in the rest of Asia. Of course, in Korea, that was a different story, even though they were taken over by the Japanese at an early date, much earlier than any other country in the region, except Taiwan. The Koreans were terribly victimized after about especially after about 1929. And there were parts of southern China that were relatively remote, where the people barely noticed the Japanese occupation. Certainly in northern China, the Japanese occupation was rapacious and quite lethal. Lots of people were killed, and so on. In southern China, this is a very broad brush again, there were many of the more remote areas, some of which I've traveled to, and I've talked to people who were old, who were past 80, and they were around during the time of the arrival of the Japanese. The Japanese would typically just come into one of these remote places, make sure that that there were no guerrillas, and then they'd move on, and they would never even come back. And this was, as I think we've talked about previously, the Japanese had a severe overreach problem when they fought this war in Asia. They tried to take too much. They did not have enough people. They were only able to occupy major cities, and they had to leave the countryside to itself. But these enduring antagonisms between Japan and China and Japan and Korea can still be seen today if you just take a look at the news media. Going on to slide 15, we'll talk now about Australia. Now, you may have noticed that Australia was not on that list of Asian countries, and yet I included in this course. I have not assigned very much reading. I've assigned, I think, no reading on Australia. I've assigned some videos, and that's because there's already a lot to do. But the reason that I'm including Australia, going on to, now hold on, let's just stay where we are for a moment. The reason I've included Australia is that over the last 5 decades, over the last 50 years, Australia has slowly become something like an Asian country, and just as importantly, besides recognizing that it's in truth part of Asia, it also has started to pragmatically move away, in some ways, move away from the West. Yet it retains this these military and political and intelligence links to the West, which is very important in modern history because it means that through Australia there is this method by which Western, principally American influence has been had. Go on to slide 16. The Tyranny of Distance. This is the name of a book that was written, I think, back in the 1980s by a professor of economic history at the University of Melbourne named Blaney. And his book talks about the ways that Australian history has been influenced by this, by the fact that its closest relationship was with Britain, but Britain was 23,000 miles away. That's a long way. Yet here, on this, in spirit, you can see that Australia and Britain are, or were, almost next-door neighbors. 12,000 miles, sorry, where did I get 23? 12,000 miles distant. So, until World War II, one of the symptoms of this cultural closeness was that Australia and New Zealand had the highest proportion of ethnic English and Irish people outside of those home countries. And the idea that Australia should remain a white country, you can see at the bottom of this magazine it says, "Keep Australia White." This idea was a very resilient one. Go on to slide 17. I want to review now. You can see the same pictures you saw before. Australia is, why is Australia not considered a Southeast Asian country? It's partly because of that legacy, I think, of the idea that Australia should be kept white. Australia is not an Asian country. And because Australia wasn't ethnically an Asian country in any sense. Even if you consider the native peoples of Australia, they are so different from the native peoples of the surrounding Asian countries to the north that this was another reason why people didn't consider Australia to be an Asian country. And indeed, Asians did not consider Australia to be an Asian country. And that idea is that it really is in Asia is relatively recent. But if you take a look at this map, I don't want to go over this city by city, but you can see that the capital, Canberra, is in the southeast, near Sydney, which is the largest city. Sydney has about 3 million people. Today in Australia, there's 23 million people. Back at the end of World War II, there were only 7 million people. We'll get into more of that in a bit. And the other major cities are Melbourne, Adelaide, Brisbane, and Perth. Darwin is way up north there, and Darwin was bombed by the Japanese in 1942, which was the beginning of the end of the idea that Australia was not in Asia. We'll stop here and go on to slide 18.